The content you're about to hear may be graphic in nature. Listener discretion is advised. This is True Crime XS.
So obviously we're continuing going down our path of home for the holidays. Today's case comes from kind of a weird place. I read about this from VPM, which is a part of NPR and PBS for people who follow that. And when I read about it, I was like, oh, wow, this is terrible. So I'm going to tell you what I read at VPM. This was earlier in the year when I read it. But it said, Virginia Review Panel recommends action following podcast on former forensic analyst. So this is written by Megan Polly over there. And when I read stuff like this, I get interested in the article itself, but it's sort of where I end up going with all of this that ties it back to home for the holidays for us. So the article starts out, earlier this week, a state scientific advisory panel recommended alerting all parties in potentially thousands of past criminal cases involving former state lab analyst Mary Jane Burton. It's estimated that Burton analyzed biological evidence in about 10,000 cases during the 1970s and 1980s, although it's unclear how many convictions related to those cases hinged on her lab work. Amy Curtis Jenkins, who is counsel for the Virginia Department of Forensic Science, says the department doesn't have any way of knowing the number of people who might have been convicted in these 10,000 cases. So that would be something that would have to be individually reviewed case by case. The accuracy of Burton's work came into question following the VPM podcast Admissible Shreds of Evidence, which, if you're into that kind of stuff and seeing kind of how like science plays out from a legal perspective when it doesn't have to do directly with like a case or a single trial, but the overview, it's a great podcast to check out. We're not being paid to advertise them. It's just a few episodes that like you would really enjoy. So the state lab in Virginia ends up reviewing allegations made in this Shreds of Evidence podcast, and they do an internal review. And in January of 2024, they present this internal review at a meeting of a subgroup of what's known as the Scientific Advisory Committee. The Scientific Advisory Committee advises Virginia's Forensic Science Board. And the podcast details how Mary Jane Burton was known by colleagues to do subpar work, skip critical control tests, and show favor to the prosecution, and even change forensic test results. According to Kathleen Corrado, who's the chair of the Scientific Advisory Committee, she said, I think we are all feeling like we need to have further investigation following a discussion of the allegations presented in the podcast. Corrado recommended that anyone impacted by Burton's past lab work be notified about potential forensic testing errors. The specific language of the notification still has to be drafted, and it's expected to be voted on during an April subcommittee meeting. If approved, it would be presented to the full Scientific Advisory Committee in Virginia. The idea that defendants can request not just a review of the case, but then if there is evidence, have it retested to me, would be due diligence, according to Corrado. If there are any issues, if someone has a concern, it can be looked at. That makes sense to me. But the panel stopped short of calling for a full review of all Burton's cases on Tuesday, following recommendations from Jenkins. We have a very limited number of staff members that are serologists, Jenkins said. So going back and looking at the file themselves, I'm not sure is going to be particularly helpful. The subcommittee also discussed a case involving Burton's lab work that's currently in active litigation. However, this time, her errors involve an outdated forensic technique called microscopic hair analysis. And that is a practice that's been deemed highly unreliable by the National Academy of Sciences. In 2015, the FBI determined that many of its examiners had overstated hair comparisons using outdated DNA methods and encouraged state labs to conduct similar reviews. At least some of Virginia's hair examiners had been trained by the FBI. The following year, the department began a transcript review of some old cases to determine whether a forensic expert testified about a microscopic hair analysis, and if so, whether they overstated the results. The state lab is not retesting all past cases involving microscopic hair analyses brought into evidence, despite mitochondrial DNA testing now enabling the testing of hairs without their roots. Instead, they're only alerting parties in cases in which an expert overstated the significance of their hair analysis. So far, 23 notifications have been made after 49 transcripts were reviewed. A court order would be required to re-examine the evidence. We don't have a mechanism under code or law to enforce a request to have evidence retested. It's simply a request, said Jenkins. And this was during that recent Forensic Science Board meeting. But some, like Peter Newfield, who is a co-founder of the Innocence Project, told the panel Tuesday that notification is not enough. He called for retesting any hairs Burton analyzed in her 15-year career and said the lab should look at the work of other hair analysts too. These cases happened 40 and 50 years ago, said Newfield. A lot of these people are going to be dead. They may be dead because they were executed. They may be dead from natural causes, but nevertheless, they may have been wrongfully convicted. Unless you do the testing, if the evidence even still exists, no one is going to know the truth. His and other public comments led to another recommendation that the Department of Forensic Science consider all information presented during Tuesday's meeting, including during public comments, when discussing any further case review or testing. So this is kind of crazy, right?
Not really. This is actually really interesting. So this is, slightly different, but not really, because it is, I don't know that it's been like completely denounced as junk science, but it makes sense that we would emerge from a highly prosecuted time where a lot of people were charged and prosecuted and carried out, if it's a death sentence or life in prison or whatever. It makes sense that we would in turn have to go back and undo a lot of mistakes that were made. It is actually amazing to me because at the beginning of what you're saying, I've talked before about how in court there's parallel roads. There's like the legal process, and then there's like the narrative of what actually happened. And sometimes those roads, there's a vast divide. Sometimes those roads are perpendicular instead of parallel, right? And so in this particular situation, when you think about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which is what the fundamental belief of our country is, it would be that this is insane. Absolutely. Any conviction that was gleaned from one of these circumstances has to be immediately reviewed, right? Except, again, we've got those separate roads that are, parallel, sometimes perpendicular, where it's going to cost a fortune to undo this mess. And in some situations, it's not going to be undoable. Now, why? I do believe that at certain points, especially when, you're talking about 40, 50 years ago, I realized they were trying to work with what they had. And on a forensic technology level, I don't feel like there was a lot of buzz that hey, someday this is all going to be undone through DNA, right?
Yeah.
I feel like they were working with what they had. And again, I don't know what I would have thought 50 years ago, but to me, it would never make sense for somebody to be convicted off of a microscopic hair analysis without way more evidence. Yes, it could very well look like a hair, but a hair didn't kill the person, right? And a lot of hairs look similar from a lot of different people. And so I don't know if I would know better 50 years ago, right? Do you have any idea?
I wouldn't know this was possible. I mean, from a scientific perspective, I think the people working these cases, on behalf of the prosecution and the state crime labs, I don't think they would be the types looking into the future on, like, as far as we are. Because like you said, like some of these cases are 50 years old.
Well, let me ask you this. Like anytime you've ever watched anything, especially, 80s, 90s, and you would fiction or nonfiction, whatever, and they would say, oh, we compared the hair samples and they were a match, right?
Right.
When you heard that, did you believe to yourself, well, that's some really good evidence?
I don't know that I thought to myself, that's some really good evidence, but I can tell you that, like, I didn't know enough to know that, like, some of what I was seeing was completely unreliable.
Okay. And see, to me, I've always said, well, it's possible, but that's not definitive, right? To me, in certain things, like especially like some of the craziest stuff would be like paint chips or whatever. I'm like, the paint chips match. I'm like, there's a lot of paint chips that would match, right? Yeah. And just a general, and okay, so once you get some FOIAs back, you realize that, especially with the FBI, all of the analysis done by technicians are subject to the technician's professional opinion. Okay.
Yeah, that part gets weird, but yes, you're 100% right.
So basically that means you could have two equally qualified forensic technicians that are FBI that could look at something and they could each have a different opinion, that both opinions, even though they contradict one another, could be accepted in certain contexts. That is not good. That's not a good way to source evidence, right?
Right.
Like ever. And so I understand, making the case. I completely understand what's happening here. Now, in the context of looking at something and being able to say, okay, we have this case, and here this case is somebody that was found guilty, and it appears that a lot of weight was put on this hair evidence. And it seems like it falls in line with our finding now that back then our examiners overstated how accurate the comparison was. And they might have, I'm not saying they did it maliciously, they may have believed what they saw, right?
Yeah.
And so, how much consideration does it take to go through all the cases and do that, right? I don't think it would take that much. And I really, really, really hope that there weren't that many cases that the only thing standing between guilt and innocence was one microscopic hair analysis that was overstated by the examiner. That's horrifying if it is a lot. I don't know what it is. Do you know what the answer is? I don't know what the answer is. But to me, that's a reflection of a deeper, more systemic problem than is even being covered here, because it should have never been the case that a conviction would lie on just that, right? Ever.
Well, okay. So to answer your question, technically there's not a lot of cases where it was just microscopic hair evidence standing between someone and a conviction or an exoneration in terms of the legal process. Unfortunately, the microscopic hairs and other evidence related to this is kind of how time goes on, as highlighted in these 13 cases, so today's episode, we're going to talk a little bit about several of these cases. Unfortunately, it was used as a tipping point, if that makes sense. So really the evidence that's presented could kind of go either way, but the microscopic hair evidence in a couple of these cases is used to, quote, tip the scales toward guilt.
Right. And I understand that, again, assuming good faith at the time, thinking that they were presenting accurate information that was helpful to justice, not just aiming to convict somebody. I do believe it's possible that if this is your job and you are scraping the bottom of the barrel to figure something out, you could have faith in this process, right?
Oh, yeah. And so there's other aspects to this that I wonder about. So one of the aspects I wonder about is do you blame the person that did it? Did they not know what they were doing? Was it poor training? Was it like the budget was so slim at the time, this is who we could hire? What was happening at that time that we end up here? And like, were those corners we were cutting, meaning sort of like different jurisdictions, state, local cities around the US, like, was it worth what's eventually going to like come to reckoning?
To that, I would say it's actually like a process problem, because they could look at the same hairs today and get the exact same result, and it's still, DNA could say that that's not the match that they said it was. So it's actually like it's a high level failure. When you don't have DNA and you're like, well, this hair looks exactly like that hair, which it could, but hair is hair, and it is not individually definitive ever.
Yeah.
I would say that it would be more of a narrowing down than anything.
Yeah. What I thought we would do to talk about that aspect of it is I thought I would like kind of go through what the Registry of Exonerations, and in this case, the Innocence Project, said about one of these cases, and kind of tie it to a couple of the other cases and kind of look at it. So see if we could identify what had gone wrong here. So, while it's home for the holidays and typically we kind of stick to one or two people and one crime, this is going to be multiple crimes, because I felt like it was important to highlight the butterfly effect that happens here, where something that happened continues to affect the local system. Because we're talking about, like, what I just read you guys is from stuff that's ongoing in 2024. But the first case we're going to talk about goes all the way back to 1981. And while those two things are directly linked, they are linked to so many other things. Like you were saying, like, how many cases could it be? It's a lot. The best way I can think of to explain it is sort of to like these are lesser crimes. Like, typically we're talking about somebody who's gotten like life for a murder conviction and they're getting out. These crimes are not necessarily murder convictions that we're talking about here, which I think makes it even more egregious. And that's because you and I live in the age where we're trying to catch up on backlogs of DNA analysis from assaults and from sexual assaults. And to see the resources catch up is like a really awesome thing. But to see that they're then going to have to be redirected to something like this it's pretty deflating, don't you think?
Deflating would be one way to put it. Horrifying would be another way to put it. It has made me realize, when you look at our clogged court system for criminal justice, the amount of serious violent crimes that have occurred is not reflected there, right? Like, we have a lot of crap going through the judicial system on the criminal side altogether. The judicial system has its very own economy, right? Yeah. The economy relies on all these hand slapping. I don't even know what you call it, where you got to go, you got to pay, you got to, deal with junk. And like, these are not crimes, right? I mean, they are because the law says you can't do it. And I'm talking about citations, infractions, things that are nonviolent offenses that keep the judicial economy moving, right? When you're talking about a serious case involving, somebody's death or somebody being assaulted or some other violent crime that really matters, that's really all that matters there. And if you do a comparison, there's way more people facing ridiculous punishment for things that aren't any of the things I just said, right? Yeah. And it's astounding. And so it sort of makes you wonder, like, what the heck? I do feel like it's worth the offset of sacrificing the low-lying fruit of the judicial economy to get justice in the violent crimes, the actual crimes that matter, right? Do you see what I'm saying here? I'm saying that
I'm following.
Okay, yeah. Like, it would be a worthwhile payoff to exchange the monotony of the resources being used for things that don't matter to get actual justice for people. There's so many times that doesn't happen. How many times are, if you go to any courtroom in any county in the United States on any random Monday morning, you're not going to find very many cases that are worth the resources being expended upon them. Think about that.
I would say that our country's law enforcement, police, and judicial system work together on a lot of cases that, for a myriad of reasons, there's a lot of time and money wasted, if that's what you're getting at. Yes.
Well, right. And okay, so putting aside the waste part of it, if you want to waste it, fine. But make sure like all of the important stuff is done. To me, justice involves getting somebody out that's factually innocent as much as it does putting someone who is, guilty with physical evidence available to show their guilt in prison. To me, those are way more important situations. I feel like we, as a society, we're too quick to lock people up for things that don't matter. And we're very, very slow when it comes to making sure justice happens when it counts.
Yeah, I would agree with everything you said there. This case that I chose to lead off here has a couple of twists in it that you can't write. If you wrote it in fiction and put it into a television show or a movie, people would tell you that it was too unbelievable. We're going to go back to August 14th, 1981 to Norfolk, Virginia. And the crimes that we're looking at here are sexual assault and robbery. The perpetrator at the time, who was later exonerated, is a young black male. He's 26 years old. The official contributing factors are mistaken witness identification and official misconduct. And this is one of those that when the question is asked, did DNA evidence contribute to the exoneration? The answer is yes. And this all takes place in the state of Virginia. You can find this on the registry at the law school at the University of Michigan's National Registry of Exonerations. You can also find information about it at the Innocence Project, at the innocenceproject.org homepage. So it says, in less than 1 hour on the night of August 14th, 1981, 2 women in Norfolk, Virginia were raped. Both victims eventually identified Arthur Lee Whitfield as the assailant. In 1982, he was convicted of one of the crimes, and he pled guilty to the second crime in order to receive a lighter sentence and have some of the outstanding charges dropped. The first victim had been accosted as she got out of her car. The assailant threatened her with a knife, stole her money, and ordered her to undress. The perpetrator then raped her and left her there. She drove to a friend's house nearby and she reported the rape. At trial, she testified that she had several opportunities to view the perpetrator by the light of a streetlight and the spotlight of a nearby house. At the police station, she picked out 7 photographs. One of those photographs was Whitfield's, and she subsequently identified him in a live lineup. The second victim was attacked shortly after the first. She had exited her car. She was accosted, threatened with a knife, and raped. At trial, the defense argued that Arthur Lee Whitfield had been misidentified. Both victims described their attacker as having no facial hair, but Arthur Whitfield, at the time, wore a beard. Whitfield's family testified that he was with them the entire evening of August the 14th. The jury convicted, and Whitfield was sentenced to 45 years. He pled guilty to the second crime and received 18 years to run consecutively to the first, for a total of 63 years. So because he pleads out to the second crime, he's not going to have a chance to appeal that crime. But theoretically, on the conviction, he could appeal it. By the time we catch up with Arthur Whitfield, his appeals are exhausted. So in October of 2003, Arthur Whitfield files pro se. So by himself, he's going to represent himself under the Virginia statute that governed post-conviction DNA testing that had been passed in 2001. The response to the court and from the state at the time was that it appeared that the evidence in his case had been destroyed. So we're not talking about a murder case here. We're talking about a very serious sexual assault and robbery happening twice all in one night to two different victims. And that evidence over time has been lost. However, in December of 2003, the state crime lab in Virginia found pieces of the evidence taped inside a notebook of the serologist who had originally tested it. Mary Jane Burton, who we were just talking about, had, against the protocol for the state lab, saved samples from the cases that she had been working on. In 2001, evidence located in a similar manner had exonerated a man named Marvin Anderson. We're going to talk about him in just a second. And in 2003, the evidence that Burton had saved in Julius Ruffin's case was tested and exonerated him. All right, so you guys know it's home for the holidays. We're talking about wrongful convictions. Had you ever heard of any of these people, Matt?
No, I hadn't.
So it's sort of a double-edged sword, isn't it? Like, she's breaking lab protocol and apparently was not a great employee, according to some of the things that you can read about her on the internet.
Why was she saving the samples? So was she being pressured to get a conviction and she knew otherwise? There was a reason she was doing what she was doing. What was it?
I don't know why, but she ends up being in the crosshairs of the forensic science community in Virginia in 2024. And all these cases that we've been talking about. But when I look at it all, I have the same questions you have. Like, why was she keeping this strange documentation? Is it trophies? Is it because she knew something was wrong and like she hoped that one day somebody would figure it all out? And I don't come to a really good answer like immediately. I'm going to talk for a second about Marvin Anderson. Marvin Anderson, his is a 1982 case. And he's mentioned here in the middle of Arthur Whitfield's write-up. He's from Hanover County, Virginia. At the time, he is a very young black male. He's 18 years old. The contributing factors to his case were mistaken witness identification. So his case is a little different. On December 14th of 1982, so about a year after the 1981 case, does that make sense in time? He's 18 years old, and he ends up being convicted by a jury of forcible sodomy, robbery, abduction, and 2 counts of rape. He gets sentenced to a total of 210 years imprisonment in the Virginia State Pen. The crime that's related to is a young white woman is approached on a bicycle July 17th, 1982, by a black man who was a total stranger to her. The assailant then beat her, threatened her with a gun, he raped her, and he sodomized her. She goes and reports the crime, and a police officer there singles out Marvin Anderson as a suspect because the perpetrator had told the victim that he, quote, had a white girl. Marvin Anderson was the only black man that the officer happened to know who lived with a white woman. Because Anderson had no criminal record, the officer went to Anderson's employer, and he obtained a color employment photo identification card. The victim is shown this color identification card and a half dozen black and white mugshots of other men, and she's asked to pick out the perpetrator. So she picks out Marvin Anderson, the only color photo in the batch. Within an hour of this photo spread, she's asked to identify her assailant from a lineup. Marvin Anderson is the only person in the lineup whose picture was in the original photo array that had been shown to the victim. So she identifies him as the lineup as well. At trial, the victim gets up on the stand and she testifies in detail regarding the assault. In addition to the rape, she testified that her assailant had pried her mouth open and had forced her to take his penis into her mouth, and then he had forced her to consume fecal matter, and he had urinated on her. She again, at trial, identified Marvin Anderson as her assailant. There is serology work that had been completed by the Virginia Bureau of Forensic Science at the time, and it was unhelpful to either side in the trial. Anderson's trial counsel, they offer up an alibi defense, which includes Anderson's white girlfriend. From the very beginning of the case, people in the community became aware that the most likely suspect in this case was another black man named John Otis Lincoln. The bicycle that the stranger rode up on to the girl had been identified as being used by the assailant. It was identified by the owner, and they said that John Lincoln had stolen it from him approximately a year and a half before the rape. So although Anderson requested that his attorney call both the owner of the bicycle and John Lincoln as witnesses, his counsel decided not to do it. It wasn't in their trial strategy. So an all-white jury convicts Marvin Anderson on all counts. This was the very first time that he had been in trouble with the law, and he received a series of consecutive sentences that totaled 210 years. In 1988, John Lincoln, he comes forward and he admits that he had been involved in this crime. So 6 years later, he shows up and he says, I did it, not Marvin Anderson. At a state habeas hearing in August of 1988, John Lincoln confesses. He offers details of the crime under oath in open court. The same judge that had presided over the original trial of Marvin Anderson declared that John Lincoln was lying, and he refused to vacate Marvin Anderson's conviction. At this point in time, a coalition of civil rights groups, church leaders, and members of the state legislature, they petitioned for Governor Wilder to declare clemency for Marvin Anderson in 1993. That petition is denied. In the years after that conviction, DNA testing slowly becomes widely available, and Marvin Anderson sought to prove his innocence of the crime. He insisted that the sperm and semen samples be subjected to DNA analysis. His lawyers were told by the police and the prosecutor in the court that the rape kit and its contents had been destroyed. Anderson ends up contacting the Innocence Project, and in 1994, they take on his case. In 2001, Dr. Paul Ferreira, who's the director of the Virginia Division of Forensic Science at the time, he advises the Innocence Project that certain physical evidence from the case, including sperm and semen samples recovered from the victim's body, had been located in the laboratory notebook of Mary Jane Barton. She was the criminalist who had performed the conventional serology in this case in 1982, and the woman that we've been talking about. Had Burton followed policy and returned her partially used swabs to the rape kit, all evidence in this case would have been forever destroyed. So the Innocence Project, they contact the Commonwealth Attorney for Hanover County, and they agree that the Division of Forensic Science should conduct DNA tests on this evidence. In April of 2001, however, the director of the Virginia Department of Criminal Justice Services, they deny the request for testing. They cite the current number of cases pending in the division and the potential for establishing an unwelcome precedent. The director announces that the department would permit post-conviction scientific testing only upon a defendant's attorney showing ample cause for the court or the governor's office to order such testing. So that's the attitude at the time of Virginia in 2001. They're like, we don't want to do this. But in May of 2001, Virginia ends up adopting a new statute, which is known as Virginia Code 19.2 327.1. This permits individuals convicted of a felony to ask the circuit court that entered the original conviction to order new scientific analysis of previously untested scientific evidence. The Innocence Project, in conjunction with multiple other entities here, including the Innocence Project of the National Capital Region at American University, they file a request under this new statute. And in the fall of 2001, they win a motion to have this stuff tested. They initiate the process of getting this evidence back into the lab that it's already been sitting in. So on December 6, 2001, the results exclude Marvin Anderson as the perpetrator of this crime. But because the evidence was heavily degraded, the profile obtained was limited to 4 STR markers. When the profile was run against Virginia's convicted offender database, it matched 2 inmates. Although the identity of these 2 men was not officially revealed, it appeared that one of the inmates was John Lincoln. On August 21st of 2002, Virginia Governor Mark Warner granted Marvin Anderson an absolute pardon. So this is going to be 20 years later. He spent 15 years in prison, 4 years on parole, because he does end up getting out on parole. He goes to prison in 1983, and after 15 years, he is released, but he's going to be on lifetime parole. So he's doing all of this work in his own case while he's out on parole. So over the next 3 years, Virginia is going to link more defendants to this DNA material that's found in Burton's files.
Right. And so, from what we just talked about, I'm thinking that there's going to be cause in every single one that she kept.
That's what I'm thinking. Like I'm kind of leaning towards that. And then I go, well, that doesn't sound to me like a terrible lab person.
No, it's not. But so here's the thing. So it can be confusing sometimes. You can lose sight of the bigger picture. It's very easy to do. It's very human to do. When you are working in a state lab, you do what a law enforcement requests. You do what the prosecution's office requests. It can almost seem like instead of seeking justice, you are working to convict someone.
Yeah, you're doing what your bosses request, and they got a lot of people that are, like you said, all those people are breathing down on the lab.
Oh, that's a hierarchical problem. It's not just going to be the person doing the test, but when I don't know what was happening, but I do think that, especially since like there was a guy that they knew that everybody thought did it, that wasn't the guy that was convicted, that then confessed, but then they didn't buy the confess. Like, it's really weird. It's a strange situation when you've got somebody going, I did not do this, and you've got somebody else going, I did this, and nothing's happening, right?
Yeah.
It's weird. No matter how hard everybody tries, at the end of the day, the state is paying for the evidence that is wrongfully convicting these people.
Yeah. And it's their people. Like the scientists involved here are, for the most part, either employees of state or employees of contractors for the state.
That's what I'm getting at. Like, so it becomes this thing where while certainly you realize what justice entails, so justice entails the truth of the matter. Sometimes the people that it appears you're working for don't see it that way.
Right. I 100% agree with that.
And so it can be hard, right? And it could lead a well-meaning lab person to save samples that she thought were relevant for whatever reason. I find it interesting in that type of bureaucratic disaster zone, which is what it is. She's got stuff shoved in her desk. I mean, I guess she didn't leave the building with it, right? In that type of disaster zone, though, think of put yourself in the position of the lab tech, right? And you're going, okay, so if I want to keep my job, I got to do this, which would be like, give these opinions that lead towards a conviction, right?
Yeah.
Even if, while I can see the completely subjective basis for what I'm saying, I don't believe it, and I don't believe that this is justice. So I can keep my job and do what they say and then have that weigh on me, or I can speak the truth. They're going to lose the case, and I'll probably lose my job. That is a bureaucratic nightmare.
Yeah.
That is not something that a lab tech is going to take on. Right? They're going to do the job that they're expected to do to get the paycheck that buys the food and clothes and pays for the electricity, right?
Yeah.
This is a classic example of the parallel roads that I talk about, in not just in court, but here's a situation where you have a very well-meaning person that can't do the right thing because of the system being stacked against them.
Yeah. And I can't, it's interesting because it sort of turns out like she's the bad guy in all of this. And I don't know if that's true or not yet. I have one more case of her related to her that I wanted to talk about with this. This is a 1981 crime where a young nurse is assaulted and raped after an assailant breaks into her apartment. Several weeks after the attack, this young nurse is in an elevator at the medical school in Norfolk, and she sees a maintenance worker. It freaks her out, and when she leaves the elevator, she promptly calls the police, and she identifies this maintenance worker as the person who had broken into her apartment and raped her. So this maintenance worker's name is Julius Ruffin. Julius was 28 years old at the time this happened, young black male. Again, all the sources are the same on these cases here. At trial, Julius Ruffin's girlfriend testifies that they were together. She is his alibi. But the victim said that she was absolutely positive that Julius Ruffin was the assailant. Scientific testing is presented at trial that says that the semen from the scene, from the crime, is linked to a group that would only include about 8% of African American men. They go through one trial with a hung jury, a second trial with a hung jury, and finally in 1982, at a third trial, Julius Ruffin is found guilty. But just as in the case of Marvin Anderson, who we were just talking about, for some reason, Mary Jane Burton had kept bits and pieces of the evidence from Ruffin's trial in her lab notebook. This weird behavior, again, leads to DNA testing being performed. So in 2003, they perform a DNA test on the swab sample she had kept. And not only is Julius Ruffin excluded, but another incarcerated man, a man named Aaron Doxey III, who was in prison for rape, is linked to the sample. Doxey is also eventually linked by DNA to the rape that Arthur Whitfield had been wrongfully convicted of. This is kind of crazy to me, but this is what's interesting about it. And I wanted to ask you about this part. If Mary Jane Burton doesn't keep this evidence, everything just goes about like these guys are guilty.
Correct. Yeah, and there's so many cases.
How many more people are there where, I mean, we know, like in this case, there's at least, so we have the three we're talking about right now, Arthur Whitfield, Anderson, and Marvin Anderson, and Julius Ruffin. There are at least 10 more that are attached to the evidence she kept. And at some point we may come back and talk about them. I just was baffled by this. Admissible Shreds of Evidence is another podcast on that. Just in case you're over the holidays, you want more stuff to listen to. There are several episodes that are really good. They talk about Mary Jane Barton. As for these guys, in terms of Julius Ruffin, he ends up being able to be completely pardoned, and he gets, I think, $1.5 million to $2 million in total compensation for his time in prison. But he was in prison for a long time. With Arthur Whitfield, he ends up getting a little bit of compensation. That's been more recently. I do know in 2009 he got a portion of like maybe $600,000 or so. Marvin Anderson, he got some kind of weird annuity where he got like some cash up front for his time in prison, and then he gets 40 or 50 grand a year for life. I just thought these cases it was fascinating they were all linked together, and they're all linked to this woman, and this woman is causing all this hubbub. But like, I have yet to hear in all of this somebody go, well, hopefully there's not more Mary Jane Bartons, because then you know what I mean? Like, they need more Mary Jane Bartons, in my opinion.
Well, possibly. There's a lot there that, it's so complicated and so much time has gone by. But I will say that it's always going to boil down to the truth of the matter in seeking justice, right?
Yeah.
That's not a subjective subject.
Yeah.
I just use like the word to describe the word. It is not something that is arguable.
It's not optional.
Right.
It's not optional. Yeah.
Exactly. And to me, it seems like it would be a no-brainer.
Yeah.
Right. And I just am not sure. Maybe I do realize that a lot of time you can be in a situation where the person because this comes down to using resources, right?
Yeah.
And so when you've got somebody that's responsible for balancing the resources, also responsible for making these crucial decisions, it's never going to work out in the interest of, well, I won't say it's never going to work out. I'm just going to say that it can be more difficult to do reasonable things, right?
Yeah. Well, this one, it's a really depressing case. There is more information about it that you can get together. I'm not sure if we're gonna do more of this or not. It's one of those I've been digging into, and I've been looking for there's a couple other cases I think are similar where you have a lab person who worked for 20 years or whatever. One is in the 80s and the 90s, and they kind of kept information back. I'm kind of with you on this, thinking to myself, it was this kind of like a roadmap of sorts. Like, these were the ones I didn't understand how the match was made, but this is what my bosses said to do. I think this is one of the more disturbing Home for the Holidays episodes, to be honest.
Well, it is. This type of stuff is truly what nightmares are made of because, well, with the debunked stuff, I mean, it's slowly but surely coming around. But otherwise, the only thing worse than, so scientific evidence is a lot of times it's very hard to refute. But when somebody that is able to present that, manipulates it for a different outcome, it's just as scary as the justice system was without credible scientific evidence.
Yeah, it is. And it's interesting because I hear all the time, and I think of the justice industry as the justice industry. It's kind of there are aspects of it that are really weird to me, as far as when you got the Innocence Project cropping up everywhere and all these exoneration projects and different things. But then you see a case like this, and it's that's why we have to have that. It's ridiculous that we have to have it, but that's why we have to have it.
Right. And someday we will look back at the statistics of everything that occurred, how much it cost everybody.
And be disturbed, very disturbed.
And the justice that was denied or delayed or whatever. And it's going to be disappointing because it's not going to have served its purpose, I don't think. And the deeper you look into sort of understanding the justice industry, the more disheartening it is, honestly.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with you there.
Special consideration was given to True Crime Excess by LabRottiCreations.com. If you have a moment in your favorite app, please go on and give us a review or a 5-star rating. It helps us get noticed in the crowd. This is True Crime XS.
The season twinkles under starry skies, and Kris Kringle's drinking sherry wine. How I wish you were here to start my Christmas tears. Presents wrapped underneath the tree, hung the stockings up 1, 2, 3. If it could only be you here with me. I love you so, but only Christmas knows. One day it will be my baby and me. Santa's helping stringing up the lights. Winter's wonderland is just outside. How I wish you were here to stop my Christmas tears. Maybe next year we'll be holding hands. I'll be singing, you'll be making plans. If it could only be you here with me. I love you so, but only Christmas knows. One day it will be my baby and me. 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 I love you so, but only Christmas knows. One day it will be my baby and me.
True Crime Excess is brought to you by John and Meg. It's written, produced, edited, and posted by John and Meg. You can always support True Crime Excess through Patreon.com, or if you have a story you'd like them to cover, You can reach them at truecrimeaccess.com. Thank you for joining us.
This is just a reminder that we are part of the Zencastr Creator Network, and I've put a link in the show notes if you guys want to check it out for your own podcasting needs. I've always enjoyed using Zencastr. Their quality is great, and we were able to join their Creator Network at kind of a key time in their history. I have enjoyed it. I've considered a lot of other places to record and a lot of other ways to put together and host and distribute our podcast. But I've stuck with Zencastr the longest. We've been with them for hundreds of episodes now. And I'm putting a link in the show notes where you can check out what they have to offer and see if it's something you would want to use.